So great ideas often take more than one talk or lecture to expand adequately. That's why we have courses in universities rather than single lectures. And the success of the Reef Lectures supports the concept of a trilogy of contributions, enabling a number of deep explorations around an important unifying theme. This is the first rendition of the King's Lectures, and they've so far been extremely successful. I expect them to remain part of King's academic year now, decades into the future, one of the highest profile and prestigious platforms we have in the university. Another great advantage of a series which develops its theme over 3 acts, our subtitle, A Theme in 3 Acts, is that we can hold each lecture at a different campus. Hopefully many of you in the audience will have attended the first lecture at Guy's, or the second at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience, Denmark Hill. But this format also means that staff and students at 3 of our major campuses have at least one chance to attend locally. I should add the first 2 lectures have been recorded for uploading on YouTube, so if you missed them, you can access them later. And tonight's lecture and panel discussion will be live streamed. All 3 lectures will be published by King's in due course. Our speaker for this series is, of course, Tony Anthony David, a most distinguished colleague, Professor of Cognitive Neuropsychiatry, NIHR Senior Investigator, Vice Dean for Academic Psychiatry at the IOPPN at King's. Tony qualified in medicine in Glasgow, 1980. He was one of those individuals of whom there were a small number at the time, who trained in neurology before entering psychiatry here at the Maudsley in London. He has a master's degree in cognitive neuropsychology. He's been an honorary consultant at the Maudsley for decades and was awarded a personal chair from the then Institute of Psychiatry in 1996. He was appointed Vice Dean for Academic Psychiatry a few years ago. He has incredibly wide and diverse research interests. He is that much abused term, a Renaissance person. And he's made research contributions in many areas, from cancer to chronic fatigue, schizophrenia to hysteria, neuroimaging, both structural and functional, and epidemiology, and a number of others. Currently, he is especially interested in the concept of insight in schizophrenia and how this relates to treatment compliance. Professor David has published no less than 550 papers in scientific or medical journals. He founded the journal Cognitive Neuropsychiatry, and he has co-edited a number of important books, including The Neuropsychology of Schizophrenia, Disorders of Brain and Mind, The Self in Neuroscience and Psychiatry, and an edition of Leishman's Organic Psychiatry. He is a Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, an NIHR Senior Investigator, a Fellow of both the Royal Colleges of Physicians and the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and a former Chairman of the British Neuropsychiatric Association. He is a member of the Experimental Psychology Society and a founder member of the British Neuropsychological Society and the British Neuropsychiatric Association, having been chairman of the latter for some years. I had the privilege of first hearing Professor David lecture when he gave the 4th and the annual John Toulmin Lecture in Law and Psychiatry, which was an absolute tour de force. I realized that we had a thinker in our midst, a leader in his own discipline, but somebody whose views were of interest to a much wider audience. So tonight's lecture is entitled Fighting Stigma in Mental Health and Losing. It will be followed by a panel discussion chaired by Professor Sir Simon Wesley, our Regis Chair in Psychiatry at the IOPPN, and following the panel discussion, Sir Simon will move a vote of thanks. This has indeed been a very special series to date. Please join me in welcoming our speaker for the first attempt at the King's Lectures, Professor Anthony David.
Thank you very much, Professor Byrne. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see such a great audience. I'd like to thank Julie Thomas, Louise Pratt, and everyone else who's organised this event. so effectively. I won't introduce the amazing panel that you're going to hear, but it's going to be quite a discussion, I hope. So the title is Fighting Stigma and Losing. Deliberately provocative, but hopefully we'll have something to say about it in due course. So this is the sort of screaming headlines that we sometimes see in our tabloid newspapers. This was a particularly egregious example following Frank Bruno's mental illness that was changed in the course of the day to a slightly less offensive front page in response to quite an outcry. As for Pammy's double whammy, I'm not sure that really was an improvement. But it's not just The Sun. Our thinking papers have also taken up mental illness and mental health in quite an important way recently. Okay, stigma and anti-stigma. Start with a definition. Stigma is defined as a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. This is a very good definition. This is from the classic book by Irving Goffman, and this is how he introduced it. The Greeks, who are apparently strong on visual aids, originated the term stigma to refer to bodily signs designated to expose something unusual and bad about the moral status of the signifier. The signs were cut or burnt into the body and advertised that the bearer was a slave, a criminal, or a traitor, a blemished person, ritually polluted, to be avoided, especially in public places. Now, sometimes we put too much store on the word stigma, and perhaps we should think of it as a kind of catch-all to include ignorance, prejudice, discrimination, and the like. I like this definition from Michael Smith, a psychiatrist. Stigma occurs in a complex mesh of relationships involving labeling, stereotyping, separation, status loss, discrimination, and power imbalances. It's a dynamic and relational process. So many people have written on the subject of stigma and how to overcome it. And this is from a review by Patrick Corrigan, who's an American psychologist. And I think we can divide it into three main broad areas: education and information, promoting contact or proximity to the out group, and what I've called activism. So I'm just going to go through each of these in turn with a few examples to help hopefully set up the discussion. So education and information. This is really aimed at challenging myths, statistics that people have in their mind which are wrong. It's really an example of rhetoric, because it's often not challenging a falsehood with a fact, but it's trying to change the way people understand various facts. It challenges stereotypes and myths. There's also the vocabulary that's used and challenging that, kind of rebranding, reclaiming terms like mad and crazy, and turning them into something more powerful, perhaps. Another approach is to emphasize how common mental illness is, or to suggest that there's a continuum between the mentally ill and the mentally well, that there's no real distinction. We all, to some extent, share something together. There's the very famous 1 in 4 campaign, and the idea that's very prominent in psychiatry today about the continuum. I'm just going to talk about those issues. And then there's the idea that if we promote a more medical view of mental illness, that it's a disease like any other, then perhaps that will help us come to terms with mental illness. Of course, that's quite controversial, and I'll come back to that. So what about the language and trying to use better language, more helpful, more positive language? I mean, I think this cartoon kind of says it all, that you can change the words of things, but the way that they're understood takes longer to change. Nobody finds that amusing? Well, never mind. Okay, moving on. So words do matter. In other examples, we've got Down syndrome, Alzheimer's disease, and how these have had a dramatically empowering effect on the way we discuss, say, dementia. I can't even bring myself to say Mongolism, as the term we used to use for Down syndrome. And should that be done for mental illness? So the term schizophrenic, it's amazing that even in the last 10 years, one never utters the word schizophrenic in a journal article or in a talk. It's a person with schizophrenia or people with schizophrenia. And that, I now find it very difficult to use the other word. I balk at it. Is that a positive change? I think it probably is. Then there are other languages that have chosen to try and get away from this peculiar term, schizophrenia, this odd hybrid Greek term. And there's a very interesting Japanese example that I think roughly translated is integration disorder that seems to be more acceptable. So the equivalent of Alzheimer's disease for schizophrenia would be Bloyler's syndrome, after the Swiss psychiatrist who coined the term, or something more to do with the presumed biochemical imbalance. And then there's this whole issue about mental health issues, and the term mental health as opposed to psychiatric. Is that an improvement in our use of language, or is that another example of us trying to avoid? Is that not another example of us succumbing to stigma, that we can't bring ourselves to say mental illness, and we use terms like mental health issue or problem or disorder? So the Institute of Psychiatry and partners carried out a very important and landmark campaign led by Graham Thornycroft, who's going to be talking to us. This was a well-funded process from lottery money, £20 million. It was largely about educating and informing, but it had many other elements, as you see here, spread out over 3 years. And from their own description, their own summary, the results were that attitudes and behavior did improve, but not knowledge. That contact, that is one's proximity and familiarity with people with mental health problems or mental illness, was an important variable, which I'll come back to. They concluded that fewer users of mental health services experienced discrimination, but it's a tiny drop. Employers showed improved attitudes when they were surveyed. A very interesting analysis of newspaper coverage, since we brought that up, showed that there were more anti-stigmatizing articles published during the course of the campaign. And another way of trying to influence future practitioners, the Education Not Discrimination Project, showed some short-term benefit for medical students only. So here, this is a graph that I made of the newspaper coverage. And so you can see that, first of all, the most common articles are stigmatizing articles, and they've gone up and down over the years. So this is anti-stigmatizing articles. You can see they've sort of crept up a little bit, probably at the expense of neutral articles. So there's fewer neutral articles, they're more likely to have a bit of a positive spin. But again, not a dramatic shift, I would argue. So what about this 1 in 4 campaign? This has drawn quite a lot of attention, which I guess is a good thing for a campaign. One of the issues is, well, what's this based on? Where did they get the figures from? And most likely it comes from a national survey, the Adult Psychiatric Morbidity Survey, which is carried out periodically on a random sample throughout the UK. But it was at 1 in 4 people in any given year, in a lifetime, at any moment. Wasn't really clear. If it's taken as in any 1 year, then it's a bit less than 1 in 4, and you'd have to extrapolate from some of these other figures. The point, I think, that was being made was that this is a common problem, that we're all susceptible. It's also an invisible problem. You don't necessarily know that it was being made, was that this is a common problem, that we're all susceptible. It's also an invisible problem. You don't necessarily know that your colleague or your friend has a mental health problem, and we should be more aware and more alive to it. On the other hand, I think the idea that it's so common has the problem of diminishing the seriousness of the issue. Certainly in the eyes of someone who's a little bit skeptical to start with. But if it was that common, it can't be that serious. And hopefully we'll come back and discuss that. Now then there's this issue, which is a bit of a hobby horse of mine, that psychiatric symptoms are on a continuum. And if you take the most, as it were, severe, most quote-unquote abnormal symptoms, psychotic symptoms, like hearing voices or having delusions, it's argued that even they are on a continuum. We're all a bit, many of us have hallucinations or have beliefs that are strange and hard to fathom. So it may be that we're all on this sort of spectrum, or it may be that although most people don't have any such symptoms, there's no real dividing line between those who have a lot of symptoms and those who have none. It's a continuum. And there's a group of people who hear voices, who identify themselves as voice hearers, who very much reject the idea that they're suffering from any kind of condition or disorder. It's part of who they are. And when you compare those people with identified patients who hear voices, are there differences? Are there similarities? Well, you can see that there are differences. The healthy voice hearers don't really know where the voices come from, but see them as some kind of spiritual guide, and they're a positive. Not many patients say that. And what they say, that sometimes that there are other people who are intruding their thoughts into their minds, or that there's some sort of device that has been implanted in their brain or in their head from where the voices emanate. Healthy voice hearers never say that. So there is a distinction. There are distinctions to be made. So the idea that we're all on a continuum, I think, has some truth and it has some legs and may well help to destigmatize mental illness. But it also doesn't explain the differences that people have and perhaps the need for treatment that some people have. This is an experiment that tried to look at this continuum versus category idea and test it in an experiment. So the researchers, again, Patrick Corrigan, got a whole lot of healthy volunteers and got them to study one of two vignettes. So in the first one, the continuum vignette, you can read it. It describes a person with schizophrenia, and he's not very different from others. You know, he has a job, etc. He hears voices, but there's no clear boundary between his experiences and other people's beliefs. It can happen to anyone. Most people get nervous at some time in their life, and like me, anyone can be hospitalized. And then there's another version of the same vignette, except they're saying it's very different. There is a clear boundary. These things don't happen to others. People don't get quite so nervous in daily lives, and unlike me, very few people are ever hospitalized. So what happens if you study these vignettes, you discuss them in a group, and meet people with mental health problems? Does it help you understand mental illness? Does it make you less stigmatizing? Well, this graph shows that the intervention works. So in terms of whether you see mental illness as a continuum on a category depends on which of the stories you studied. But in terms of whether you espouse stigmatizing beliefs, look at this line. So this is just the effect of reading and studying the vignettes. So a higher score is more stigmatizing beliefs. There's no difference. What does make a difference is if you studied those vignettes and you had the opportunity to talk to people with mental illness, then if you didn't have any vignette, you were highly stigmatizing. If you had the categorical one, you were much less so, and a bit less so more if you read the continuum version of the story, although that wasn't statistically significant. So there is something perhaps in it. Now what about this idea that mental illness is an illness like any other? And the idea here is that it's something that happens to a person. It's not their fault. You'd never say, it's just cancer, get over it. Why do some people say that about depression? And for people, for example, carers of people with relatives or friends with schizophrenia, the idea that the person can't get out of bed isn't because they're lazy, but it's because they have negative symptoms of schizophrenia, and that's well recognized. Isn't that very destigmatizing? I think it is, and there's evidence that that's very helpful. On the other hand, the other side of that coin is that the person is somehow not in control of their behavior. It might mean that they're less predictable, and they're somehow a passive victim of their condition. So it is a double-edged sword. But what effects does it have? So this was a very well-written study in America from some sociologists, and they looked at a survey of attitudes between 1996 and 2006, during which time, in the intervening period, there was a lot of press and coverage and education on this idea that mental illness is a disease like any other. So what were the effects? So between that decade, when you ask the people, did they see schizophrenia, depression, or alcohol dependence as a mental illness, anything going up in this direction is sort of positive in that sense. So people, this is like more than 600 people, somewhat more likely to see it as an illness, perhaps as a chemical imbalance with a genetic or neurological basis, rather than just ups and downs, rather than bad character, except for alcohol dependence, which remained in the eyes of many to be bad character, and not anything to do with the way you were brought up. And who should treat you or look after you? More people said in the intervening period, a physician or a psychiatrist. It was appropriate to be in a mental hospital if you had schizophrenia, which seems correct. Medication was seen slightly more relevant to these diagnoses in 2006 compared to 1996. But then when you were asked, well, how would you feel about working alongside a person with these conditions, or having them as a neighbor, or socializing, or marrying? Do you think these people are violent to themselves or others? And you can see it's all up and down. There's no significant change. So even though people were somewhat more likely to take a medical view of those conditions, it didn't have any desirable effect on stigmatizing attitudes. So it's kind of like this. Is this better? Well, not really. So that's education and information. What about promoting contact or proximity? Just to cut a long story short, this is an idea that became current particularly after the Second World War, known as the human relations movement. And it was that any group stigmatized or discriminated upon comes because people don't know what people are really like. You break down prejudice by getting to know people. And this is a very nice summary of all the work that had been done up until 2000 on various topics. So this is about, does intergroup contact reduce prejudice for people with different sexual orientation, racial or ethnic group, physical disability, mental illness, nationality, or just being old. And that's the mental illness one there in the middle. So this is an effect size for those interested in statistics. So that means that stigmatizing attitudes were improved by a minor to moderate effect. And this was things like having community care, having supported living programs in the community so that people get to know people with mental illness rather than just believing that they should be shut away in an asylum. That improves people's attitudes to a small but significant extent. But I guess it's quite intensive. Here's an example of that. This is about the town of Heel in Belgium and St. Dymphna. It's an amazing story. So we're in the 7th century in Ireland. Dymphna is 14 years old. She consecrates herself to Christ, takes a vow of chastity. Shortly thereafter, her mother dies. Her father, deeply in love with his wife, is affected badly. His mental health deteriorates. He's advised to remarry, The father, Damon, agrees, but only on the condition that his bride would be as beautiful as his deceased wife. So isn't that a sweet story? After searching fruitlessly, Damon began to desire his daughter because of her strong resemblance to her mother. So not so sweet, in fact, a bit creepy. And when Dymphna learned of her father's intentions, she fled, eventually landing in Belgium, where she took refuge in the town of Kiel. Once there, Dymphna built a hospice for the poor and the sick of the region. Damon travelled there to recover his daughter and tried to force her to return with him to Ireland. She resisted, so he cut off her head at the age of 14. So a church was eventually built there honouring her, and it became a place where pilgrims went from all over Europe seeking treatment for people with mental illness. The church expanded and became a sanctuary for the mad people, was overflowing so that people had to take them into their own homes. And this was the tradition that is going on until the present day and is envied by many. So the people involved are not called patients, they're called boarders, and are treated as ordinary useful members of the town. So again, if you think that's a nice picture, that's actually the beheading of St. Dymphna, and it's a really gruesome scene. So here's the church, the modern day church of St. Dymphna. Here's a picture of some bemused residents, and that's the old infirmary, and now the current one built in 1983. Looks just like a rather nice psychiatric hospital. So that's education and that's proximity. Finally, activism. So what do I mean by this? Well, this is about asserting rights and taking a positive outlook from the bottom up, as it were. Some people call this saneism, equivalent to racism, if you think the sane are better than the insane and have more rights. We've got in the middle of this the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, which says people with disabilities should never have to have treatment imposed upon them against their will, or for anyone else to make decisions about them. And this would certainly prevent abuses of psychiatric treatment, but it would also mean that people with dementia, learning disabilities, severe mental disorder, coma, they wouldn't get any treatment. So although it would help in some ways, it would probably deny a lot of people treatment that they need. So there's a great deal of interest and debate about that. And then there's more political actions, like the slogan, "No decision about us without us," parity of esteem. Should our health service not realize that it needs to put more money into the care of the mentally ill, equivalent to the physically ill? And there's, of course, legislation that can be passed, anti-discrimination legislation. But finally, just the idea of people who have suffered from mental illness standing up and being counted and making their own case. Standing up against stigma. I'm mentally ill and I'm proud of it. And reclaiming pejorative terms, but perhaps within reason. And then this is a very great spokesperson, Carrie Fisher, sadly no longer with us. I'm mentally ill, I can say that. I'm not ashamed of that, I survived that. I'm still surviving, but bring it on. So thank you very much for your attention. These are the things we might want to discuss. Is this a winnable fight? What should we be doing differently? Are we looking at the wrong issues? Thank you very much. So I think Professor Wesley's coming to take the chair and chair the panel. So I'm
good, you're at the end. It's good. So could I ask our panel to come and take the stage? I'm going in the middle, Graham, you're going to be here. The rest of you can fight it out. Excellent. So Graham, you're at the end there. Yeah. Some of you have taken the long way round, but others haven't. Okay, so
Simon's there.
The rest you just avoid that, lovely. So, Let me then introduce the panel to you very briefly. So in no particular order, as they say on these chat shows or whatever it is. So first of all, we have Hussein Manoir. So that you're there, thank you. He's an amazing fellow. I just looked up your Twitter account. You said you were the biggest underachiever in your class in 2005. That's true? It is, excellent. But now, strangely enough, things have changed. You're about to be an astronaut. You're a poet. You're the winner of the world record for a mental health awareness lesson. It's amazing what they have world records for, isn't it? But anyway, you and Till Wykes up there won that. You're a rapper. You have your own YouTube channel, Hussein's House. And you're indeed one of our newest fellows of Kings. So well done on that. But the reason we love you is quite simple, because we asked you to join us for a very posh dinner this evening, and you refused, saying that you were going to Nando's to celebrate your birthday. We love a cheap guest, we do. Now, then, Alistair Campbell also is a world record holder, well known for many things, but you probably didn't know he's the world record of the most number of relay laps in over an hour in a velodrome. I mean, isn't that amazing? No, it isn't.
It's true.
Apparently it's true. He showed me a picture.
Edit your own Wikipedia.
You shouldn't have mentioned it, Alistair, you shouldn't. But he's an amazing campaigner as well for mental health, and just an example of his writings. If this panel gets too boring, which it won't, but if it does, just go and look up on his website, or indeed on the web, his eulogies for Charles Kennedy, and indeed for his brother Donald, who had chronic schizophrenia, and you wrote straight after his death the most extraordinary tribute to your brother, unsentimental but insightful, full of love, compassion, etc. It's one of the most amazing pieces of journalism I have ever read, genuinely. So that's Alistair. Then who have we got next? We've got Hannah Jane Parkinson on the end there. Hannah is the Guardian correspondent for lots and lots and lots of things, so many things that I've even lost my notes about you. But you do social media, you do politics, football, mental health, all sorts of things.
I don't really do the football anymore.
Don't you? Oh, what a shame. Okay, bad luck. Oh, God, you must be a Tottenham supporter then. But you also, today, you've written in The Guardian an article on the state of mental health in this country, and it's not very good. Okay, but you also... But I did love the fact you did also tweet, which is a mistake, and you did say here that city boys only listen more to you if you are drinking cognac. So that was what you said. Yeah, I've tried that. It didn't work for me. Anyway, and then who else have we got? We've got Sue Baker, you already heard. It's from Time to Change, which you set up in 2007, and it's now gone around the world, I think. 4,000 businesses, thousands of schools, lots of universities, including this one as well, which we're delighted for. You're funded by, I've got here, the National Lottery, Department of Health for Comic Relief. Hang on. No, sorry, the Department of Health and Comic Relief. Sorry, and Comic Relief. My fault, sorry, my mistake there. And finally, Graham Thornycroft, you all know, one of the most distinguished professors of psychiatry and expert on everything else. I have absolutely no idea why you're here, Graham. Oh, no, you've written a book on stigma. So you have. There we are. Which he is trying to sell. Alistair's also written a book he's trying to sell. In fact, the only person who hasn't written a book is me. Right, so Graham, you're going to kick off with a response to what Tony said. You're not going to use PowerPoint, well done. And you're going to keep it short, even better. And off we go. The shorter you are, the more we love you.
Excellent. Oh, good evening, everybody. I said good evening. That's more like it. Hello.
It's not music for you,
Oh, yes, it is. So it's great. Thank you for inviting me, and it's very nice to contribute. So I love a talk that starts with an ironic title. But of course, we're not losing, we're winning, or at least we're winning against stigma in this country. So what do I know? Well, I know a bit. So I've been doing stigma research and working with Sue and others in stigma practice for about 15 years. I've published about 100 papers or so on stigma. I've written my book. This is the knowledge transfer moment. I've set up an international network of people doing stigma now with colleagues in 61 countries all working together. And we've produced a lot of scales to measure aspects of stigmatization which are now translated into about 20 different languages. So I know a bit about it. So where should we start? Well, the situation in this country until 2008 was dire. And we've heard from Tony about some of the problems. Stigma was getting worse. You saw the Frank Bruno headline. Well, that was typical. We had those all the time 15, 20 years ago. But things have changed. And there's an interesting idea here between the difference between contribution and attribution. What has time to change changed? Well, it's not all because of time to change, but it has contributed enormously over the last 10 years since it started, including by the contributions of Alistair and many others. So just a few facts. We're in a research institution. Let's look at some of the true facts. So we've seen attitudes improve by 9.6% of the whole population of this country, 4 million people over the last decades, towards people with mental health problems. We've seen discrimination received by people with mental ill health from friends drop by 15%. We've seen discrimination overall drop from 42% experienced by people with mental ill health to 27%. We've seen likelihood of want to live with somebody with mental illness go up 15% to 72%. I could go on. We've seen many, many indicators, and with Claire Henderson and I, we've been leading the evaluation of time to change over this last decade. So there's no doubt that on most indicators, we've seen stigma gradually decreasing over time. We saw some of the newspaper. What Tony didn't show is extending those newspaper cuttings findings, because about 2 years ago they crossed. We now have more anti-discriminatory press cuttings than discriminatory risk press cuttings for the first time ever recorded. We've seen 11% now wanting to work with somebody with mental illness. I work as a consultant psychiatrist in South London. I work with young people in the first episode of psychosis. I see, week by week, the evidence of the patients I treat finding it somewhat easier now to get back into work and to talk. So let's talk about disclosures. And we saw some examples earlier. People who in the last few years have been talking openly, not supporting anti-stigma campaigns, not endorsement, but disclosing, talking about their own experiences. Prince Harry. How many people have seen the Prince Harry coverage recently? About the Prince's Trust, about Ted's Together. It's amazing. Adele, Serena Williams, Alistair Campbell, Selena Gomez, Andrew Flintoff, Andres Iniesta, Stormzy, Bruce Springsteen, Lady Gaga, Rhoda Thornycroft. Who's she? Well, she's my mother. And when I was 3, she developed a very severe, sudden and severe episode of depression. She wanted to put her head, also my head and my sister's head, into a gas oven in the days of coal gas. And she got help. In fact, the medication didn't help her. She needed ECT before she recovered, and she recovered fully, and she never became depressed again. So we've seen a lot of progress, if you look even the last decade, even more if you look back historically. We still have huge problems. We've got a long, long way to go. We've seen discrimination drop by about 15%, so 85% of those huge barriers are still there. It can change, it's early days, we're on the right track, we've got to keep pushing ahead. We see worse physical health care for people who also happen to have mental illness, contributing overall to a 10% less life expectancy for all people with mental illness, 10 years, and 20 years less life expectancy for people with severe mental illness. We talk about parity. This is gross disparity. We haven't seen the right investment in mental health care in this country. We've seen that rates of employment are still pitifully low for people who have experience now, and sometimes people who have had experience of mental ill health. And we are a long, long way from making such progress, not only in low-income countries, but also across many countries within Europe. Now, what do we know? What have we learnt? So another plug, I refer you to a detailed literature review published 2 years ago now in The Lancet on evidence of effectiveness to reduce stigma. And the lessons are few, and the lessons are clear. It comes down, as we heard from Tony and Sue might mention, to social contact. The basic lesson is simple and clear. Social contact, social contact, social contact. Either in-person contact between people with mental ill health and others, or virtual or filmed or other televisual contact. It all seems to be as effective if it's well done. For young people, best to take place in the educational settings, and social media and film, increasingly clear, can actively reduce stigma. So we're on the right track. We need to continue to build up the evidence, but we're not losing. In England, we're winning. Thank you very much.
Jane, if you ask me to come in at this point, I mean, all right, so either we'll stick with you. I mean, all he's just said is that journalists are now a bit better behaved.
Guardian journalists were always well behaved. I am going to be shorter because I was drafted in, so I have no notes. But yeah, journalists I think are better behaved. We have, when I joined the Guardian, which was 4 years ago, I annoyed everybody by handing out the Samaritans guidelines, media guidelines, and sort of making sure. I remember in my first month, because I started on sport, someone described a football game as bipolar, because one half was, like scored 4 goals, and the latter one, it was a draw, but I mean, no goals. So I kind of, and the 1,200 killed by mental patients headline was actually the day of my interview at The Guardian, and we discussed that. So I actually came across as quite wild and raving, I think. There is definite improvement. I think, I just said to Graham that my attitude, I think, actually there has changed in the last couple of years, because I agreed with a lot of what Tony said, his points, because I have this huge piece coming out in Weekend Magazine in about a month, which I am keeping it short, which it's difficult because I didn't want to rub people's backs up, but I think it's so great that we're talking about it more, and there is all this sort of awareness raising, but I've sort of got to the point where I'm sick of talking, because I know it sounds kind of negative, but I think that the crux of it was for me when I was sectioned a couple of years ago, and then last year was sort of in and out of hospital, and I came out of this appointment at the psychoanalyst, and after we just kind of sat there for an hour, he was like, "Oh, it's going to be a 2-year wait list," and I'd just been moved from a 1.5-year wait list, and then I kind of opened Twitter or something, and someone had, like a famous campaigner, be like, "Oh, it's great that everyone's talking because now they can go and get help," but it's like, actually, no, you can't. The system at the moment, and that was when I just thought I have to write this piece, and the thing you mentioned about it's just another illness. One of the things I really, really hate, and I understand why people say it, and apologies if anyone said it here, but the whole kind of, mental illness, it's just the same as a broken leg, it's just the same as asthma. It's like, it's really not. And if anyone's got bipolar and asthma and wants to tell me how they are, that would be great. But I think the stigma, there are certain types of stigma, and obviously stigma is awful, but I sort of, and again, maybe this is controversial, I feel like sometimes you can be a bit disingenuous about where it originated from. Like, I think people don't talk about internal stigma. When I'm going through a really bad episode, I sort of hate myself. When I've been in hospital, there have been other patients where, because I'm not in the right frame of mind, that I have found quite scary, or, I remember one time I was kind of crying to this, the mental health nurse, because I said, "Oh, I feel like a fraud, I write all these articles about anti-stigma and how awful stigma is," but I also was like, the person in the next room keeps coming into my room, like chopping up copies of the New Yorker, and that's quite frightening to me. And I felt really, really sort of in these two minds. So I think so much good has been done, but I would really sort of wish that there were more focus on bipolar or schizophrenia or things that weren't more common as depression and anxiety. I think people have really done great things by talking more about that, but I think it definitely shouldn't be something that someone is ashamed of. But I think it's fine to acknowledge that sometimes your behaviour changes with mental illness in a way that you can do things that actually are quite shaming, and you need people to be supportive of that. But also we need to sort of talk more openly, not just in kind of inspirational Instagram hashtags where hey, be positive, or be proud that you're mentally ill. I'm not ashamed of being mentally ill, but it feels very weird for me to be so proud of it. No, that's just very odd to me. So I do, that's, my own plug is read this piece if it comes out. It's being sat on at the moment because of duty of care. But yeah, sorry, I've rambled. Sorry.
That's what you do when you don't prepare. God help you when you do. So I was saying then, I mean, you were raising awareness in this huge lesson that you did.
Yeah.
Can we have too much awareness? Is it possible we can take it too far?
I don't have no notes either. A big part of the lesson was about education, hence the partnership with King's and Professor Till, because I'm not an expert in this subject, I'm just very passionate about it. But some of the stuff, like you mentioned in your lecture, that information is not accessible to people like myself, where I come from in East London. And one thing I found was, when I announced it on my social media that I'm going to do this mental health lesson, it wasn't young people reaching out to me, it was teachers, it was staff members, it was head teachers, it was super heads of super academies that are privately run in this country. And we found ourselves in a position where we had to say no to some because we didn't have the space and stuff like that. And I think one thing that isn't really spoken about a lot when it comes to stigma is stigma for the Black and Asian community, because that stigma is so bad. It's a different level. Like, some of my friends, if you was to say to them, go home and tell your mum you have depression, your mum will turn around and tell you you're possessed by a witch, or like there is a demon inside you, and that will ostracize you from your family, it will kick you out from your community, it will like lock you away. And it's so real for people living in this country. That's why, like, when it was more than just a lesson, it was like kind of like I don't want to like sound cheesy, but like a safe place for like people to come together, and young people especially, because I just wanted to make something with Professor Till that if you can't talk about it at home, you can come and you can talk about it here with us. And even if it's just momentarily or it's temporarily, that wasn't meant to rhyme, but you can come and do that. But yeah, I agree with you completely. Education is the most vital thing. I really believe we need it in the schools, and I don't think it's something I can sit here and blame teachers and say, oh, it's my English teacher's fault I didn't learn about depression. It's not their fault. It has to come from the top and work its way down, but can't wait for that. So that's why we're on the ground trying to just educate, because if we know what we're talking about, it becomes easier to talk about. Like, I can't even think to go home and tell my dad about schizophrenia because my dad doesn't even know like when his birthday is. So like, but it's true. Like, I'm Pakistani. I come from a village. My grandparents come from a village. They don't know a lot, but they know enough to have got me where I've got to. So I kind of feel like it's my responsibility now to learn and take that a step forward and educate myself on the matter. And yeah, just go into schools. And I think if you know something about something, there's no stigma to it because you feel confident to talk about it. I never thought I'd be able to sit here at King's College and talk about mental health. I went to Westminster, I studied in building surveying. I didn't study this, but it's all about education, I think. And I think the right dose of it with like your Instagram and your celebrities and everything, you get the right formula, it's easy to digest, and then we have less of a problem. But yeah, a lot of the work I'm trying to do now is all for like people that are suffering with stigma from a really bad background. Yeah, and if we're plugging things, yeah, I'm just going to say, well, I'm going to. I write poetry for the betterment of human life. I don't have a book, but I perform a lot about mental health, and I'll be doing a show at Jazz Cafe in June. So if you want to come down, please come down.
Best ever is.
Yeah, Jazz Cafe in Camden, June 20th. Tickets on Ticketmaster. You can follow me. Follow me on Instagram, Hussains_house.
I love the fact that Alistair knows exactly how to plug things brilliantly. Just gave you a few hints there. Sue, though, I mean, one of the big studies that's been done recently suggests that most people who have mental health disorders now know that they do. Okay, they may not know what to do about it or won't want to do something, whatever, but they know that they do. So is your job done then?
Oh, no, long
well,
way.
Obviously you were going to say it, but go on.
Because I need to keep a job. No, it's not. I just think, it's been a really helpful debate. I don't think we've won. I think we're on a journey. We've always said this is the work of at least a generation. In my maths, that's sort of 18, 20 years. We're 10 years in. We're definitely making progress. We know that. I mean, one of the godfathers of the stigma world is the lovely Graham over there. I feel like some kind of terrible talk show presenter. No, the lovely Graham over there. But he is one of the... Yes, the lovely Debbie McGee.
That's right.
And we've definitely made more progress in this country than many other parts of the world. So stigma is a global problem, just like mental health is. There are very few communities that don't stigmatise and discriminate and isolate. There are a few. But so we've done a lot of learning. We've been on a big journey. We've empowered lots of people like me and many of us up here and many of you in the audience to challenge stigma. So not just to talk about it, and I totally agree, just talking about it isn't the panacea, it's not the silver bullet. It's a way of getting more people to realise that they know somebody with a mental health problem, whether that's at work, at school, at home, in the football club, or the I don't know, some kind of knitting group or something, but that you do know somebody and that we're not monsters and we're not those terrible headlines that we used to see time after time. I first started at Mind in the mid-90s when every single media coverage and every debate, political, social, media, celebrities, was all about stabbings in the community because we'd shut the asylums and chuck people out on the streets without proper investment in services. And I think we're picking up all the damage of all of that terrible discussion. And if that is a way of getting investment in services, my God, are we paying the price for it? Because actually stigma, I think, it's historical, but a lot of it came from that terrible dialogue when mental health was a bit of a political and social football. And I think things have massively transformed, certainly not job done. I think if you look at other forms of discrimination, we work a lot and learnt a lot from Stonewall in the early years of our work, especially with employers and schools. It's an ongoing journey, hate crime, whatever type of hate crime that is, homophobic bullying in schools, homophobic attacks. It goes up and down. Very few types of anti-discrimination campaigns can say, job done, tick, nobody faces any discrimination. So I don't think we're ever going to be able to say, which is a terrible thing, but I don't think we're ever going to be able to say there is absolutely no discrimination in society, but we can say that there's major progress made, but a lot more work to do. And I thought, Tony, you were actually going to say something about the failures in stigma is because we haven't got parity of esteem, we haven't got an equal footing and investment of physical and mental health. Suicide rates haven't come down. I was waiting for all these wallops of evidence about why stigma's not working. And I think, absolutely, there is far more to do. But we're still, believe it or not, even 10 years in, still in the foothills of social change as I talk about it. The risk is that if you don't keep pushing this agenda and don't keep driving further change, you might slide back, and mental health has been the thing of the last decade, and we can't afford to do that because we've got so much more to do. Just two quick things that just show you the kind of appetite. I personally don't think the Royals would have said anything about mental health, let alone their own, unless there'd been a big warm-up exercise beforehand, and we've worked with them quite a lot behind the scenes. They wouldn't have expected so much good public response. So there's a marker that, even to get the royal family talking about it, they must have been confident, I know they were, that they were going to get a good response. Harry talking, massive spikes, 40% more people coming onto Mind's website, 30% more onto Rethink's website, just around the days that he revealed it. And I think that's really helped with the male agenda. And we've certainly got a lot more work to do with men. We're not expecting men to talk so openly. We know men don't talk to a GP about any health issue, let alone, mental health. But again, we've launched a campaign aimed at what we call cold men, the cold male audience. It's obviously not including people on the panel here, but people that don't know anything about mental health. And the blokes, as we call them, the guys that don't think they have ever known anyone or will ever know anybody or ever experience a mental health problem themselves. So despite all this conversation about campaigns and talking, it hasn't reached quite significant proportions of the population still, and that includes quite a lot of men, and that's where our focus is at the moment. And just on black and minority ethnic mental health, so much more progress needed in terms of service provision, police interaction, detention and everything else that goes on, including sectioning. So there's a lot more progress needed, but definitely on the stigma front, an awful lot of progress made.
Okay. Well, you mentioned the male agenda. I want to ask you about that, but it's the Mail on Sunday agenda. Because if you saw it 2 weeks ago, 4 pages on exactly the type of headline that you were mentioning, exactly identical, ruining the reputation and character of one of the best psychologists we know. So I go back to you, Esther, maybe it is just on the surface. You don't have to scratch very hard to see that it actually hasn't changed.
No, I think there's been a huge change. I mean, can I just give you a word of advice? Never ever read the Mail.
I knew you loved it.
Your life becomes a lot easier if you just decide the Mail does not exist. And you do not allow it into your space. No, I do think there's been huge progress. I have a completely different worry. And that is that I think we're winning the battle on stigma, but the policymakers are using that as an excuse not to do what we need to do on services. So I think that is a real problem. Theresa May becomes Prime Minister, she stands on the steps of Downing Street, she says that mental health is going to be a priority. Well, it's not a priority. Priority means more important than the others. Let's just be honest about it, mental health is not a priority for the government. We've only got one priority, I'm afraid. I won't go on about Brexit tonight, but we know what it is. Yes. So that is my worry. I think that and I totally agree that I'm sick of talking about it, because the truth is that I do a lot of these talks, and the fact is there aren't that many of us, and we're always the same people being wheeled out, and we talk and we talk and we talk and we talk, and yet the services, I think what's happening is more and more people, because we're winning the battle on stigma, more and more people are thinking, you know what, I think I might be ill. I think I might need help. And you then have these experiences of going and finding out, well, if you wait 2 years, you might be seen. And David Cameron, Theresa's predecessor, he made a...
They are university graduates.
Yeah.
They do know who she is.
Okay. I'm making the point that we've had two successive Conservative Prime Ministers who have said this is a priority. He said, David Cameron, when he came out, and he said that he had a pledge, historic pledge, politicians like to have historic pledges, that parity, he talked about we're giving parity of esteem. Now, parity to me means the same. Priority means more important than the others. Parity means the same. He said, if you have a psychosis, we're guaranteeing you'll be seen within 2 weeks. I've had psychosis. It's like 2 weeks. If you're talking about parity, the physical health equivalent of psychosis is going through the windscreen at 100 miles an hour and rolling down the motorway and breaking every bone in your body. Now just imagine if somebody came along and says, don't you worry, in 2 weeks there's going to be an ambulance here to take to hospital. So I think we're winning, we're talking the talk. And the talk is going really, really well. And the papers are better, and we're seeing loads on soap operas, and it's great. But the talk is not taking us far enough, fast enough, and it's doing my head in.
But really, for all the panel, I got a bit of a bad press recently for all sorts of reasons, but one particular one was I wrote something about the fact that we should really stop having mental health awareness weeks now. We should have mental health delivery weeks. Because we have an aware population, and it is all about delivery, but I have to say, quite a few people said, oh, no, that's absolutely dreadful. We need to
you need
more
both. You need them going alongside each other. But I worry at the moment when I see politicians standing up and talking about this. I feel at the moment they are using what we do as a bit of a substitute for what they need to do, which is to genuinely make this a priority. Because at the moment, I think we're slipping down the priority scale at the moment rather than going up.
Okay. Yeah. Let's take some questions from the audience for anyone, but can we have questions and really not statements, because we haven't got much time. So, anybody?
There's a man there.
Oh yes,
He looks like he's very succinct.
He does look like he's succinct, you're right. He's apparently very succinct. We will need a mic because we are recording it. Actually, you were shout.
Audience participation.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, I'm a public relations consultant. How can we help, particularly the journalists on the panel? How can we help? Can we be doing anything? What needs to happen so that you're enabled, people at the Mail are enabled to be talking better about this?
That's an unexpected question. You don't know anything about PR, do you? So do you want to see what can PR people do?
Help us.
No, I actually do think it's interesting. Anna said that, you know, when she started the Guardian, said, here's the Samaritans. So, you know, there is a lot of good stuff out there. I think it's actually taking it. I think you got, you know, I regularly say to people, you want to kind of get your head around this stuff, do look at the Time to Change website, do look at the Heads Together stuff. There's a lot of good stuff out there. It's kind of getting it into the mindset of people. And I think also we do need to do a bit of, you know, we talk about, you know, the stigma that people with mental illness have to endure. I think we need to stigmatise journalists a bit when they do stuff. No, not you, because you're an award-winning superstar of the mental health world, and we love you. But I'm talking about when the bad stuff happens, we really have to call it out. We really do have to sort of say, excuse me, what you said. There was one recently which it was borderline for me, but I nearly picked up the phone. It was when there was that big survey about antidepressants. Do they work?
Yeah.
Do they work? And by the way, if I may plug a documentary I'm making. I'm not. But I am doing a book signing later in Namibia.
You're being together.
Yeah, we did a book signing. No, but the Sun did a front page headline, which is "Keep on taking the happy pills." Right? Yeah. Now I thought it was borderline. Because I thought, wow. The Sun are doing this thing, a positive survey about the use of antidepressants, and they're doing it on the front page. Fine.
We wrote to them about that.
Did you?
Yep, we did.
Interesting.
Yeah, we did.
Okay,
don't know what the response was actually. Don't like it.
Didn't like it.
No, they always say that. They always say happy pills.
Yeah.
They're just very unhelpful.
Isn't there a danger that
So I think that was, you know, they need to have it in their minds. That's not a good headline. We need to explain why.
But equally, we could also be sounding just a bit priggish here, because I'm told that sub-editors who write these things, are usually much better judges of actually what the real kind of zeitgeist, or whatever you want to call it, are, than people like us. So that's really aimed at you, Hannah, because you do work on a newspaper.
Is this?
And plus,
do I need
sometimes, you know, shaming people doesn't actually change attitudes.
Do you say shameless people?
Shaming people.
Oh, okay.
Shameless people
so
do change attitudes.
So it's interesting if you're in the newsroom, then the Guardian has a kind of workflow system, so the copy will go in. So say I'll write the copy, then it goes to the desk editor. This is already boring actually, so I'll just and it goes to various people. And although obviously we have no money anymore, so it might not go through as many people. Because I'm there and everybody knows that at work, and actually the Guardian are really supportive. Sometimes people will come and ask me, like, you know, for advice and whether something's offensive or not. And I'm kind of glad that they have that kind of sounding board, and we have now we sent out a global. Kat sent out, the editor-in-chief sent out this global to sort of, you know, make sure people are all on the same page. There are some terms that I actually don't find offensive, but that I would, for media purposes, would say that we should never use. For instance, I personally don't find kind of if someone killed themselves offensive personally. I would always say that we shouldn't write that in print and media because we have that responsibility. I think on the question of the PR, it's difficult because you do, as Alistair and Sue said, you want to kind of pick up the phone and educate someone. But in this sort of polarity that we have now, whether these kind of culture wars going on, I think that the editors and the journalists themselves and the proprietors of papers have to want to change. And sometimes I have noticed almost that there are certain right-wing papers who, because they're pushing against this sort of snowflake situation, they're almost like, well, no, we're gonna call someone schizophrenic rather than someone with schizophrenia, because they're sort of like annoyed by this kind of liberal emptiness. So I think that is an issue. But I think, just kind of getting the guidelines and the education is the thing. But you really have to, the papers have to take responsibility. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. We'll take another question. Lady at the front. Yeah.
You haven't mentioned judges and their sentencing. And I find that some of the language used by judges when they sentence people can be very, very unhelpful towards the understanding of mental health. And I just feel it's, they call people monsters, they call people, when people clearly have an illness or something. I don't know what you think about that.
Okay.
Because
Probably a tricky one for the panel. Anyone with experience of being in court recently?
No, not in court recently, anyway.
Reported in the,
Okay.
I mean, and not in the Daily Mail. I'm not talking about that.
No, I'm
What
sure
they
somebody.
actually
I've
say.
got a memory of somebody doing some work with the body that represents judges, but I can't recall it for the moment. But you're absolutely right. So whatever gets then reported in court, if it's available for reporting, is verbatim, and you can't challenge that. It's something that can be openly, widely reported. I think one of the things I noticed, and we did do some work at Mind many years ago, was what was happening in coroners' inquests, and some of the language there wasn't very helpful at all. And I think improvements were made there. So absolutely, I think we need to maybe have a look at that and have a conversation about it.
I think also the thing about, I mean, you know, judges are a pretty easy target, but I do think that anybody who's been inside a prison knows that the place is rammed with people who would be better off in hospital.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
So, but that's the thing.
We'll try and do something about that.
That's a different,
I
bigger
want-
point.
It's how they're
I want to
labelled
pick
when
you up
they
on
are
one point, though.
sentenced.
I want to pick you on something that
Doesn't
I remember
everyone
being
understand?
at a forensic psychiatry conference, and the thing was about stigma, and then one very senior forensic psychiatrist pointed out that some of the things that patients in forensic psychiatry have done should be stigmatised. And if we don't say that, people will think we are really strange. And judges are just reflecting someone's done a terrible crime. It's reasonable to actually be fairly pejorative about that, at the same time as looking for why and at disposal. So I just think we have to be a bit careful. Graham, you wanted to come in.
Yeah. Thanks, Simon. Two short comments. First about the journalists. I think not punishment, but much better is nudging and recognition and reward. And Sue might want to say a bit about the Mental Health Media Awards every year, which are an amazing way to recognise good practice in the media. On judges, even if across the country we see attitudes gradually, slowly going in the right direction, there are still many subgroups where that's not the case. And so we've done work with police officers exactly to do this, to try to reduce stigmatisation. With the same principle as everything else, social contact, having people with experience, lived experience, as the teachers, as the active ingredient. It's where service users are the only active ingredient to reduce stigma. And police officers are very interesting. They said, you know, we'd never seen people with mental illness well. We'd never seen somebody recovered after, because what we do, we only ever have contact in the extreme situation. Somebody's very unwell, we're taking them to a place of assessment, place of safety. And it's so refreshing to see people can and do get better. And I suspect judges are not dissimilar. They only see the worst cases of human experience, and that forms their general view about people with mental illness.
Yeah, sorry, two short comments as well. First one about PR. I think we do unfortunately live in a world where bad news sells, and because it sells, it's numbers, isn't it? However, I think the power has changed, and the shift of power has changed, and we all, like, I don't know about you lot, but run platforms, Twitter, have access to people and can send messages to thousands of people. If we can just get creative with how we're sending these messages editorially, it will take over. For example, I did an experiment once on Oxford Street, and I called it the Oxford Street Experiment, where I stood there blindfolded and had a board in front of me that said, if you've suffered from mental health, hug me. And within like half an hour, I'd say about 95 people hugged me. And I put that video online, and that video, it took over. And it did really well. And a lot of the newspapers who once would reject me and not want to like cover any of the work I was doing, I found were now fluctuating towards me because of the clickbait. So it was just about getting creative with it. Also about the judges, randomly I was invited to a lunch with like 13 High Court judges at the Old Bailey recently. It was so random. The food was whack. Yeah, the chicken was unseasoned. It was horrible. It was dry. I did not like it. However, I discussed what you said, like language and the use of language in the courtroom, and how words like barbaric and inhumane can get thrown around at people. And like what you said, sometimes if a person has committed that crime, then they should be told, but then in other situations, the difficulty, like what the judges were basically saying to me was, every case is so individual and bespoke, you can't have like a tailored approach to everything. And I was like, yeah, I kind of get that. And that was it, really.
All right, Till, you can ask the last question. It'll be short. She's my boss.
And it's supposed... One of the things that we've been concentrating on a lot is negative things. And there's the issue about trying to get optimism more into the media and into newspapers. And, you know, we're talking about this at King's College, and KCL has got a very big institute which pours out a lot of science, which says positive things about, you know, how we can help to treat and understand mental health problems. So I was just wondering whether the panel actually thought that we weren't really paying enough attention to that. Certainly, I suspect that our links, because we've got a fantastic press office and the links with the Science Media Centre, has been getting information off the health pages, which is a sign of you're either cured or not cured, to a more incremental kind of period of time where we're being more and more optimistic about the potential for people to live with mental health problems.
So this was our Vice Dean redefining the word short. Quick responses. Sue.
Yeah, I think the more of us that are contributing to society, that are overcoming the internal and external barriers of stigma, the better, and the more that gives other people hope. But we have to work on institutional structural discrimination as well. So the more of us that are talking about it in every walk of life, and that includes judges with mental health problems, MPs, celebrities, sports people, everyday people like us, the better. Because I think that is about positive hope, regardless of whether people get services in time or not.
Okay. Anyone else want to come in on that? Graham, you're writing notes, scribbling away. Don't plug your book.
So, thank you. So if I was to say to Sue, on the Time to Change website, what do people really want to read? Where do they go? It's stories. It's the stories of individuals, stories of people struggling and recovering. So that's what really, really helps people who are having difficulties to see hope and to keep going and to get better and to get support. The other point I'd want to make is that and I think many of us who work in mental health for a long time have been having discussions like this and speaking to each other. And I think the time for that's gone. I think we've got to get out of our comfort zone, out of the mental health sector. We've got to talk to every other sector to take the mental health issue much wider, to education, to employment, to politicians, particularly, as you said, Alistair. I think it's absolutely shameful that we've got a government pledged to level funding the NHS, which has been disinvesting from mental health for the last decade. We've got to get way out of our comfort zone and make alliances in every other sector now.
Yeah, I actually think there is quite a lot around to be optimistic about. You mentioned the police, for example. I think some of the stuff the police do is extraordinary. I think that some of the police have been brilliant on this. Their understanding, I think, has come on leaps and bounds. I just think here, in academia, I think that, you said very nice words about my brother and things I said about when he died, but he had schizophrenia from his early 20s. He had 20 years off his life because of the drugs, the power of the antipsychotics. But I'll tell you what was extraordinary about him. He had a job for 27 years, and the reason was he had an amazing employer, which was Glasgow University. He worked as it wasn't a high-up job, but he had a job for 27 years because they never, ever saw him as a schizophrenic. They saw him as somebody who worked there that they liked, who had a purpose, and gave something to the place. And he had schizophrenia, and that sometimes when he was ill. That was it. And I think employers, to me, are the absolute key in this. So you're right, it's about going out to employers, and Sue and I have done events with employers where you try and persuade them that somebody must not become defined by a mental illness, a label, a bound to mental illness, or whatever it might be. And I think that is where the change is coming. That's where I feel actually a lot more optimistic than I do about government or media.
If you haven't read Alistair's piece on Donald, you should. Hussein?
I agree.
I love you. Great.
You could come back anytime. Brilliant. All right. So, Hannah, do you want to...
Only very quickly, because also basically Alistair's points. Police, I think, great. There's a lot of people in the police tweeting at the moment saying they call out when there are no beds. When I was sectioned, the police were great, had massive laughs, it's brilliant, talked about LFC a lot, which are better than Burnley. Mainly because I had 22 hours to talk to them before a bed was found. Then other employment, absolutely super key, because the Guardian has been really, really good with me, and I think that is absolutely key, that employers need to be so much better, and I think that will be the most positive change.
And Tony, you can have the last word. They've all been horrible to you.
Well,
I was very positive.
Thank you. I'm pleased to have started off a discussion that I'm sure we will go on and on and on, and thank you for taking the provocation in good heart. I mean, the first lecture I talked about Oliver Sacks, brilliant writer, neurologist. Why was he averse to psychiatry? Why didn't he choose that as a career? Maybe it was because his brother had schizophrenia and he didn't like the way he was treated. I also talked about insight and the awareness a person has or doesn't have into their failings, their personality, their illness. Now we've talked about something much more hardcore, but I think the talking, there is too much talking. It can only do so much. I think Graham's research shows that you can improve attitudes quite well, but that in itself doesn't really change behavior. And Sue was saying you thought I'd be talking more about, cures and suicide rates and so on. I think if you have to wait for the breakthroughs in treatment, it will be too long to wait. We're working very hard, especially at the IOPPN, to find new treatments, to new understandings. But what we need is more resources to do that. We need more resources to care for our patients so that they don't have to take one look at the facility. They don't need to have stigmatizing attitudes beforehand, but they certainly will afterwards. And another marker would be people willing to donate their money for psychiatric research as opposed to cancer research or all the other great causes out there. I think that's a particularly good index. People like Till Wykes and others and yourselves have worked very hard to build up that head of steam for charitable donations so that we can take the research forward. We're still waiting. So please don't give up on the fight for stigma, but let's perhaps follow those leads and be more political, get involved more, and continue the fight.
Okay,
I just want to add one final thing, which is that I think mental health professionals have quite a role to play in this as well. People do report discrimination and discriminatory attitudes in receipt of services, so we've got to think about culture when people are using services, and we have to encourage mental health professionals where it's safe to talk about their own mental health problems, because we're not a separate population of people. This is in every workforce in the country. Yet those that aren't coming forward are vice-chancellors of universities. Not one has declared their own mental health issues, which is remarkable. And mental health professionals, we've really got to get some more openness and some discussion about. There are a few very, very good souls that have talked as chief execs of mental health trusts or some other key people, directors of nursing, who are breaking down stigma in the professions. But I have to say, let's look at ourselves and our sector, because there's a lot more work to do there too.
Okay, so can we thank the panel? And I have to now round up the proceedings of this three-lecture series that Tony's delivered. I noticed the principal, when he introduced you, Tony, said, these lectures have so far been extremely successful. I think we can now take out the so far. They've all been extremely successful. An amazing accolade to you and indeed for King's for hosting this. And you've heard the official version of Tony's CV and career from the principal. There's an unofficial as well. You've heard about his academic accolades. If you follow these things, H indexes and things like that, and half of you do. His is 90, which is about one of the highest in King's. It's the way you do these things, you look at your age, and if it's higher than your age, you're doing very well, and Tony's only 30. But much more than that. I've known Tony for 32 years. He is, without doubt, the psychiatrist I've most admired during that whole time. He's a model, I think, of what a psychiatrist should be. You've heard him speak and the way in which he integrates all sorts of themes in his work. He's a superb clinician and has helped some of the most troubled people that I've ever come across in my entire career at the Maudsley. He's a brilliant teacher. And I've seen him entrance medical students by proving you can teach the whole of psychiatry by taking any randomly chosen patient out of King's and just talking to them. I've been the same if you'd chosen some of the doctors as well, actually. You could have done it just as well, now I think about it. And he's obviously an amazing academic. His repertoire can run from R.D. Laing right through to the most abstruse pieces of neuroimaging. Now, I say all that, and of course, this is the kind of rubbish that you say at these things when you're doing the vote of thanks. This isn't the time. But actually, I can also prove it that I mean it, because twice in my career I've been asked, last time was by the BMJ 4 years ago, to name the people who'd had the most effect on me, and I chose Anthony Clare. Then I chose Anthony Soprano from The Sopranos, because the knowledge of the mafia is very good to survive in any higher education institute, as you know. And last, I chose Anthony David. So, at this point, I should say I think it's all over, and you reply it is now, except it isn't. One last thing, can I invite the principal to take the stage again? Because I think, Tony, we have a surprise for you.
Oh,
it's the principal.
Yeah. Thank you very much to the panel, and thank you for superbly chairing and summarising. I have two people to thank. When we conceived the idea of this trilogy of lectures, it was a little bit of an adventure because it's a lot of work. Firstly, as with the Reith lectures, to make it worthwhile, the person who takes it on has to do some new thinking. So Tony took quite a while to think whether he had the energy and time for this, and then he's put a huge effort into it. The hours that he's put into preparing these lectures are very significant, and that's why we intend to publish them, and I hope many people see them and access them who weren't here tonight. But there's a huge amount of work in organising this sort of thing, and we have somebody at King's who does that par excellence. Her name is Julie Thomas. She organised these wonderful posters, the quality of the graphics, which is quite superb, the organisation of the 3 events. She doesn't like to be acknowledged, but is she here, lurking somewhere? Look, can we have a round of applause for Julie Thomas? The way to ensure something has prestige and goes into the future is an incredibly high academic and intellectual. I say intellectual because academic may not be the right word. Quality for the first presentation. Tony has done that in spades. Julie, working with a graphic artist, has developed something we hope he will treasure. It's in a Sainsbury's bag, but it's not a box of chocolate. Tony, I hope you hang this somewhere. It takes the rather wonderful picture, a photograph of you, the name of the 3 lectures, and says Professor Anthony S. David, the King's Lectures, Inaugural Series 2018, Psychiatry, Science and Society. Please hang it somewhere nice.